closing our series on sin, and I'm sure you're glad. Not that you partake of any of these. The last one is about greed. Interesting how all the rest of them and greed kind of go hand in hand. Because greed is about self and fulfilling what I want and not really thinking about anybody else, especially God, in my heart. 1923, 9 of the world's wealthiest men gathered in Chicago at Edgewater Beach Hotel. They were quite a crew. They were comprised of the president of the world's largest steel company, president of the largest utility company, president of the world's largest gas company, the world's greatest wheat speculator, the president of the New York Stock Exchange, a prominent cabinet member of the president of the United States, the biggest bear on Wall Street, the head of the world's largest monopoly, and the president of the Bank of International Settlements. Powerful men, wealthy men, men who thought they would change the world for their betterment anyway. These supreme masters of world finance had gathered, and you wouldn't believe their lives a mere 25 years later. Fast forward to 1948. Charles Schwab died bankrupt after living years on borrowed money. Samuel Insull died penniless in another country, having been on the run from the law. Howard Hobson was declared insane. Arthur Critton was insolvent. Richard Whitney was just released from Sing Sing prison. Albert Fall was pardoned from prison so he could die at home. Jesse Livermore, Leon Frazier, and Ivan Kruger, all three committed suicide. Greed is a deadly sin. The men who had mastered money had somehow suffered the fate under its curse. The Great Depression, misusing what they had, maybe falling prey to hoarding. And 1 Timothy 6 tells us a very important lesson on greed. I wonder if these men had ever read that. Let's stand, shall we, to read from the word of the Lord, 1 Timothy chapter 6. We begin with verse 6. Paul is writing his young mentor, and he is trying to teach Timothy how to lead and how to be. And he says, of course, there is great gain in godliness combined with contentment. For we brought nothing into the world so that we can take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with these. But those who want to be rich fall into temptation and are trapped by many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. Many people misquote this next verse. Money is not the root of all evil, but the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. And in their eagerness to be rich, some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pains. This is the word of the Lord. We will get to that in just a moment, Don. You may be seated. Thank you. I love a translation of that. It's a contemporary translation. A devout life does bring wealth, but it's the rich simplicity of being yourself before God. Since we entered the world penniless, we will leave it penniless, and if we have bread on the table and shoes on our feet, that's enough. But if it's only money that we are after, we will self-destruct in no time. Lust for money brings trouble and nothing but trouble. Going down that path, some lose their footing in the faith completely and live to regret it bitterly ever after. Greed, a deadly sin. I'm sure somewhere in this world, advertisers are beginning to think of how to advertise for next Christmas. And some will say, hey, let's have Christmas in July. Because they desperately need to sell. They no longer wait till Thanksgiving table is clear, do they? They begin their song long before. And I must confess to much sarcasm about the commercialism of Christmas. It's just pitiful. Even though, as a child, I loved Christmas because you could count on something under the tree. For me, it was a lump of coal, but at least I was warm by winter. I remember one year, all three of us got one present total. But it was a racetrack. Man, I love that racetrack. Remember those electric racetrack guys? I never could keep my car to stay on the track. I don't know what the deal was. My brothers were always beating me in that race, but I loved that racetrack. I remember one year I pined for a sled. We lived in Missouri at the time, south of St. Louis. Once in a while we would, and I put it on my list. I hinted, I begged, I hinted for Christmas for a sled. I did not get one. I think we got a Monopoly game that year. But a week later, a snowstorm happened to come in. We had about 6 or 8 inches of snow, very nice snowstorm, that began with freezing rain and sleet, so the bottom on the street was just so slick and nice. Man, I wanted that sled. My birthday was January 30, and my parents very graciously decided to give me my birthday present early, which was one of those flying sleds. Man, did I have fun that year with my brand new. I didn't let my brothers ride it either. Nope, they're not going to get on my sled. They might have been greed. But it starts early in our young lives, doesn't it? Some of you remember growing up with the Sears catalog or the Montgomery Ward catalog. And some parents will let you sit with the catalog and mark off the things that you wanted, maybe making a list of them in order, in priority. Usually you want all of them, don't you? I want them now, I want them bad, and I'm not going to rest whining until I get it. There's nothing worse seeing a little kid on the floor in Walmart screaming and kicking because he can't have a toy or a piece of candy. That's greed, and it starts very early in our life. Now, do I begrudge kids their toys? Of course not. My wife has bought so many toys this last week. Toys that will never see the light of day when my granddaughters are gone. Do I begrudge my kids the toys? No, of course not. But every single thing they want? And it goes on in junior high. I don't know how it's like now because I don't have anybody except for Emily in junior high, and she's not really that conscious about, when I was younger and when my kids were in junior high, I was like, I have to wear these kind of jeans, Dad. Don't you know you have to wear these kind of jeans? You have to have these kind of shoes. And it's the most expensive shoe on the market just about. Nowadays it's those Air Jordans or whatever, and they're hundreds of dollars. Can you believe? How many of you have spent over $100 on a pair of tennis shoes lately? I said tennis shoes. I know you spent more than that on regular shoes, ladies. And then you graduate from junior high, you go to high school, it gets worse, then you get in college, and the first thing you get in college as a freshman is what? A credit card application. They all get them, and freshmen as you've got to be you. You've got to be free. You've got to be able to have anything your heart desires with this nice little credit card. And hopefully if you can get it in your mom and dad's name, now that's even better. But it's kind of strange, don't you think, that credit companies sending credit cards to guys and gals that have no jobs? But that's where it starts, doesn't it? Don't wait Don't save, don't worry, we got you covered for 29% interest. Wow, that's a deal. Premarital counseling, I always talk about finances. I always tell them, don't do what my wife and I did starting out. She had a checkbook and I had a checkbook. Same account. Honey, I just bought $100 worth of groceries. I did too. Well, we got milk this week, but nothing else, you know. It takes years for a person to be deeply ingrained into this greed. But when it takes over, it is deadly. If you think about it, God started work on his people on this greed thing very early. They had just barely cleared the Red Sea when God began to remind them, you've got to depend on me. Every day they got this manna that tasted like Honeycrisp. Man, it was wafer, it was light, it was like a vanilla wafer. You know, it would have been better if it had some banana pudding with that vanilla wafer, but this vanilla wafer every morning, and you went out and you gathered it. And God said, not only gather enough for one day, except the day before Sabbath, then you gather for 2 days, because they didn't work on the Sabbath to honor God. If you gathered more than you needed, what happened to it? It spoiled. It got maggots in it. Can you imagine? Well, I got enough for tomorrow. Ooh, I don't think so. You ever found maggots in your apple? Worms in your apple? Worms in your prune? Reminds me of the old farmer that bit into a luscious prune before he went to bed and he found a worm. He put that aside, he got another one. He bit into that, he put that aside. Both of them had worms in them. So he turned off the lamp and he just ate the last one. Sometimes we just turn off the lamp and eat it anyway because of our greed, no matter what it does to us. Greed is a deadly sin because it destroys our capacity to trust in God. We're depending on ourselves. We're depending on something else to satisfy us except God. Greed, in fact, makes us small. It makes us soulless because we're only thinking of ourselves. Do I help somebody else? Very rarely. Only when it makes me feel better. That's greed. You know, I mentioned Christmas. Just mentioning Christmas, I don't know why it's June, but Ebenezer Scrooge was like that, wasn't he? I mean, where little Tim was out making joy and happiness to everybody, Scrooge was trying to stick it to them right there at Christmas. Reminded me of the man that Jesus talked about in Luke 12 when Jesus tells them the story. He says, the farm of a certain rich man produced a terrific crop. So he talked to himself, what can I do? My barn isn't big enough for this harvest. And he said, here's what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and bigger ones. Then I'll gather in all my grain and goods, and I'll say to myself, self, you've done well. You've got it made, now you can retire. Take it easy and have the time of your life. Just then God showed up and said to him, you are a fool, because tonight you die. And your barn full of goods, who gets it? That's what happens to you when you fill your barn with self and not with God. Love that translation. I guess this man was an early forerunner of Scrooge because it was all about me. It was all about me. It was all about mine. I've taken these series of sermons from Dan Boone's book, The 7 Deadly Sins. And Dan says this, can we imagine in a consuming world to be unplugged from greed? Is there I love this is Dan's words, not mine, so don't get on to me. Is there a spiritual laxity that can loosen the constipation of stuff that clogs our soul? Now that is good writing. May not be good listening, but it's good writing. Stuff that is consumed but never passes through our hands. Stuff that clutters our lives like trinkets in a musty attic. Wow. Greed. Greed is the anger that believes we have the right. Greed is the envy of those who have the stuff that we don't. Greed is the gluttony of stuff. Greed is sloth that becomes a thoughtless consumer. Greed is the pride of having the stuff. Greed is the lust for stuff. Is there any other way to live in our Western society, particularly in this culture in which greed is so rampant? I read of a story of a family who decided that they would sponsor several poor children in Haiti. And so for about $100 a month, they would send the money to Haiti to help educate and clothe and feed 5 orphan children who otherwise would have had no hope. But in order to do this family was not well off. In order to do this, they had to skimp, they had to save, but it was their commitment, kids included. And so sometimes during Christmas, they would get a little less than what they wanted. They rode secondhand bicycles. Sometimes their presents were not exactly what they asked for, but that was fine to them. One day the family came home with exciting news. He said, guess what? My company is sending me to Haiti, and they're paying my expenses so that I can do some business there. He said, I'm going to take the whole family, and we're going to go visit these 5 orphan kids that we have sponsored for 10 years. And so they did. They went. And on the second day in Haiti, they hired a truck, and they went out to where the kids lived. And the kids had heard about it, of course, and they were eagerly there from the early morning to the school that they went to. And so this little truck pulls up, and these little kids come running out of the school, and the family embraced. They were embracing each other for 15 minutes, it seems. And in spite of the communication problem, they very well, they express their love to each other with gratitude. On the way back to the hotel, the kids were quiet, and the dad wondered, why are you so, what's wrong? Why are you so quiet? And the kids were now thinking that, Dad, we were just thinking that this has made us far more happier than any Christmas gift or thing back home could have ever made us. To be able to be a part of these kids' lives. Wow. Nothing's wrong. It's the best thing they said we could have done. Greed. I remember when 2 of my kids went to Mexico for one of those trips, and when they got back, one of them told me, he said, Dad, these kids thought we were rich. I said, yeah, you are rich. No, they thought we were rich. I said, what do you mean? They said, they thought we were rich because we had lunch. They would take their lunch to the work sites. And most of them shared their lunch with the other kids there. Ungreed started in the garden when God told them, everything is yours except one thing. This one tree belongs to me. Do not take of it. Do not eat of it. I know it looks good, God said, but this is the way you will honor me. This is the way you will obey me. This is the way you will admit to me that I am your God. I'm your Father. You're my children. Everything else was theirs. There was no sin. There was no murder. There was no thievery. What could they take that wasn't theirs already? Everything was just beauty. The food, the air, the work, the relationship, the love, the conversation, the encouragement. God would come down, and they would just talk face to face. There was that one thing, that one tree. No ornaments were said except for that one thing. I think tithing began in the garden because they were giving God the respect and the obedience he deserved because they did not take of that tree until they did. It's in the garden that we raided God's rightful place in our life when we did the one thing he said not to do. Greed. I want it all. I want it now, no matter what the cost. Later in our story in Malachi, people were giving God their tithe, but it was sick cattle, and it was the blemished of the crop, and God was saying, you're giving me your garbage as a sacrifice? What are you saying about me? Across the years, I've heard a lot of people say, hey, we don't tithe because that's an Old Testament commandment, and since Jesus fulfilled all the law, we don't have to worry about that anymore. And I ask them, well, okay, what about the 10 Commandments? You still fulfill that, don't you, as a Christian? Well, tithing is one of those principles that we do to say to God, you still own it all. I'm just a steward. I'm not a... Oh, suddenly it's gotten quiet because we've gone from greed to tithing. Well, they go hand in hand, don't they? In Abram's journey, he gave a tenth of his possessions to Melchizedek. And you can go on and point to so many times, and even Jesus said, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, a gift to God what is God. But see, it doesn't start with just money. When we talk about greed, we're talking about, are we giving ourselves totally to God? Are we holding back? Are we saying to God, I know best for my life. I can spend my money better than you can. See, God gave you life. You didn't choose to be born here in the richest country in the world, the most powerful country, one of them anyway now. You didn't choose to have this lot in life. We are blessed. We are more than blessed, folks. When the average wage in the whole world is about $1 or $2 a day, can you live on $1 a day? You could if you had to, because everybody else does in the world. I'm not trying to make you feel guilty. I'm trying to make you think. Where's God if you have greed? Where's God when you're thinking about yourself and what you need and what you want? See, that's the bottom line of selfishness, isn't it? And it's the bottom line of sin. Ignore God. Do what you want. But see, that leads to destruction because there's only one thing that will truly satisfy, and that is God. There's one thing that will help you through the horrors and the hurts of life, and that's the Holy Spirit in your heart. There's only one thing that will get you through when you're about to die, and that is the knowledge and the relationship with God that says eternity is yours when you pass that dark veil called death. We have in front these two bowls of water that have represented, it's a symbol. If you would like to come later, anytime after the service, to dip your fingers in the water and say, Lord, I've been greedy. I've been selfish. I've been holding back. I've been hoarding from you. And I would just like to say, I'm yours. 100%. Of course, you can do that anytime today. And I trust you get alone with God and ask yourself, does God have his rightful place in my life, in my heart? It's the only thing that's going to get us through, folks. The only thing that's going to get us to heaven. I want us to stand for a moment. We're going to sing. I want us to read 1 Timothy 6, and then we're going to sing. Go ahead and stand with us. 1 Timothy 6, that last verses 17 through 19. Paul ends his letter by saying this, as for those who in the present age are rich, command them not to be haughty or to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but rather on God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. See, God is good. He doesn't hold back things from you to make you upset, to make you poor, but he gives us the riches. They are to do good, to be rich in good works, generous and ready to share, thus storing up for themselves the treasure of a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of the life that really is life. Oh, I like that. We're going to sing.